All the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?
Hello, and welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast. Today we are in Mountain Air, New Mexico. Mountain Air is a smaller town, probably 35, 45 miles from Albuquerque.
Yeah, about an hour or so drive.
From Albuquerque, kind of to the southeast. And we are talking with Alex, who is in charge of a series of ruins down here that date back to the 1600s. Some of them date back to the 1300s. I have always said that Aztec ruins in New Mexico are my absolute favorite. That has just been surpassed by these sets of ruins. There is 3 different sites. I've had the opportunity to look at each of these sites before we talked with Alex. The wind has been horrendous here, so we are in a conference room, and we're going to talk, and I'm going to have to go off of memory. One disclaimer real quick is there are 3 different ruin sites, and each of them have their own name. And as most of you know that listen to this podcast on a regular basis, I can't remember names for beans, so we are going to have Alex correct me probably 1,000 times. Get used to it for this podcast. Welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. And when I heard you wanted to do this, I thought it was just the perfect opportunity to get the park out there and to get our name out there too, because it's quite a special place that usually isn't on the people's radar that it's even here.
Had it not been for my sister-in-law saying there's this really cool place you need to go to, I would not have known it was here. You've got a lot of ruins in the state that are very popular. Gila, Chaco Canyon, Aztec, I don't know. They're all over the place here in New Mexico. Coronado, we stayed at a campground by Coronado, which is just outside of Albuquerque and Bernalillo. Neat set of ruins there also. But I had not heard anything about these, and these ones here are probably the most spectacular of any of the ruins I've seen in Utah, Colorado, lots of different places, Arizona, lots of places I've traveled. The ruins are not as well preserved and as accessible as they are here.
Yeah, and if you want, I'll give you a brief little background on the park. And as you mentioned, my name's Alex Arnold. I'm an interpretive park guide here. We preserve some special sites, and we tell the story of basically a blending of cultures here. Not only are we in central New Mexico, right in the heart of the state, right in the heart of New Mexico, that's a diverse melting pot of cultures today. It was all the way throughout the centuries, dating as far back as around 800 in this area. So we do have 3 ruin sites and 4 park units here. So we do have, you're in our headquarters visitor center right now.
Right.
And then, of course, we also have the Abo ruins.
I can remember that one because that's spelled A-B-O.
That's right. That's the easiest. That's the easiest one to remember. And that one's our oldest site, we think, as far as inhabitation, as well as the mission ruins,
really?
And the mission being there. And then, of course, we have our southern unit, which is the most remote out of the 3, Gran Quivira. And then we also have Quarai, which is our northern unit, and that was the smallest inhabitation site, with Gran Quivira being the biggest out of all of them.
And in this podcast, I might just refer to Gran Quivira as Grand.
Or you could just call it GQ.
GQ.
That's what the staff calls it here, and sometimes we'll slip it out with the public, and they're like, "What's GQ?" And we're like, "Oh, yeah, Gran Quivira." Yeah.
Okay, we'll remember that. And that's the southernmost one. We
Yes.
went and visited that one on Saturday, I think.
Okay.
And what a phenomenal place! What a phenomenal place!
Sporting a T-shirt.
There you go. She bought a T-shirt at the visitor center.
There you go.
I guess if I get confused, I can just look
at
a
the
little
shirt.
bit below her neck and come up with the words.
That's right. Cheat sheet.
I like looking a little bit below her neck anyway.
Anyway.
Okay, and then the north site was called what again?
Quarai. And
Quarai.
that one is between Quarai and Abo. Those are the two most visited units of the park. Quarai is very accessible to folks that live in Albuquerque. It's roughly 45 to 50 minutes away from the east side of Albuquerque, just down 337 through Tijeras Canyon, and then hopping on 55 south there, and it'll take you right to Quarai. It's actually it's the most complete mission ruins that you'll see out of all the site. The church is more complete than any of the other churches.
Definitely.
Yes,
and the courtyard, and I mean,
yes.
you get a very good visual. You've got a placard there in front that has the outlay of what the artist thinks that it probably looked like.
Yes.
And as you're looking at that, you can definitely see the outlines of all the different foundations, and there's still 3 stories of rocks piled up. But that's the case with all 3 of your facilities. Is they're all so visible. You pull in and you see an old mission type church that's 3 stories, 4 stories high. A lot of the bricks are still intact, or not bricks, but the rocks. It's just amazing. And then you can walk through the maze.
The first time you go, in my experience, I experienced so many different emotions at the different sites.
Agreed.
Like the first time I went to Quarai, I felt overwhelmed and encapsulated when I walked into the nave of the church because the walls were so high. And there was that subtle glow of red coming from the red sandstone and the sun, and that was special. And what I can remember the first time at Gran Quivira was the amazing view. You know, you're at the high point there, and you're looking down into the valley. You know, you're just off the slopes of the Chupadera Mesa there. So you get that beautiful pinon and juniper country there. And then at Abo, I could just remember cresting the hill and seeing the majestic Manzano Mountains in the background, and them being in the background of the mission. Was just a powerful experience for me. And I think most visitors share that same view. But they're powerful places that incite so many different emotions, especially initial emotions with people.
And each one of them has, like you were saying, their own particular feel. But like when you go to GQ, you have rocks that are more of a grayish, whitish tone, and it's really impressive. And then you get to Abo, and they are dark red with a few little white rocks interspersed in the walls. And then the same thing with the north one.
Yeah, Quarai.
Quarai.
Yes. We're going to do repetition, as that's what's going to be. But no, that brings up an excellent point, and that's where some of that's where I love when you can make connections between the cultural resources and the natural resources. So, you know, culturally, all people that lived in the area, both Pueblo and Franciscans, as well as resettlement era folks, they all utilized what was readily available the closest to them. So at Gran Quivira, if you look around, you'll see exposed rock, and it's all that gray limestone. It's part of the San Andres formation. And when you go to Abo and Quarai, especially if you drive Route 60 through Abo, you just see exposed red sandstone all throughout Abo Pass. And that's an older layer of red sandstone there. That limestone, it used to be on top, but in that area it had eroded away over years and years and left that sandstone exposed, whereas at Gran Quivira, that layer is still there and exposed and readily available and easily quarried is the main point.
Well, and the quarries weren't that far. When we first got to Abo, I was walking around looking, and I'm going, there's no rocks. This is all just red soil. There are no rocks. But then as you come around the walking path, it's about a half-mile walk, well worth the walk to go around the backside, because you can see where the creek came down through there. And then you get a little bit further down, and you can see where the shale layers are that they were quarrying their rocks from. And it's just amazing. I'm also assuming as that creek came down, they probably at one point in time must have had a couple of dams across there to capture the water and put it into pools to where they were able to irrigate maybe a little bit, or at least have water for the mission.
Yes, and so we're referencing there the arroyo that runs at Abo. And Abo's a special place because you have a couple different springs and arroyos that meet in one place.
Okay.
So from the trail, you can't see the spring source.
Not at all.
But there is a spring source that generally has water in it all year, no matter the dry conditions. It's a groundwater table. So you have the bisection, the intersection or confluence of East Creek and Espinosa Creek. So you were looking at Espinosa Creek there. And an arroyo is basically a word that means a stream or a creek. But what's interesting about, or you may hear wash used interchangeably. Right. Northern New Mexico uses washes. I don't know why, but I've seen at Chaco and other places they refer to them as washes.
I would imagine that because when it rains, it washes everything.
Yes, and that's the distinguishing factor. Is folks from different areas of the country may think that water should be in it all the time, but arroyos, that's what's interesting about them. They only run when it rains. So when you see a rain cell, not only at Abo, but when it's raining in the Manzano Mountains, because that's the ultimate source of that arroyo, the water will rush through that arroyo and in fact make that road impassable. We have to close the site off when that arroyo is running, because you can be trapped on the other side of that arroyo. It washes the road out. So it does come rushing down there. And there is one area in there that has been identified as a very likely a dam site that was actually carved out by the Pueblo people that lived there, which were of the Tompiro language group. And the thought behind that is, when the water runs, it'll recede pretty quickly, pretty quickly after it quits raining. So the idea behind that is to capture some of that and leave it behind so that they could store it and utilize it. So if you look at it, though, at one point, you'll see that the rock from the stream, from the arroyo, appears to have been cut and carved. And then there's a deep hole right below it. And, the archaeology shows that there most likely was a catch basin for water that the Pueblo people had there. So then that would help supplement any sort of water issues. The spring source is pretty big there. But that was a village of about 1,400 people at its peak. You need all the water that you could get, especially in an arid environment like the high desert is here.
Right.
And they also had a very sustainable farming system at Abo, and the evidence that it was more successful than any other of the areas around here, that they had enough that they were able to trade and even supply in lean times to other pueblos and missions in the area that others could not. So that's what's special about Abo.
Now, another thing that I understand, if I understand it correctly, is that a big trade item out of all of this area was salt.
Correct.
And they have a few salt beds that you can see as you're coming in from Encino. Like from Vaughn, Encino, and coming on across, you can see several salt beds. How pure was that salt? When you drive by it, it looks really dirty and like I wouldn't want it sitting on my table and pouring it on my eggs. But at the same time, if you dig down a little bit, does it become pure salt or?
Yeah, so and I'm no expert on this, but some of the studies I've read on it is that there's a few different types of salt that's within the beds of that lake.
Okay.
And it's of different quality. Apparently there was or is salt that could be utilized as table salt in there, but the main type of salt was the type that they would utilize for the Spanish, as we discussed a little bit before the podcast, would use it in the smelting process or amalgamation, a way that they could extract silver from copper in a salt solution. So it was mainly an industrial type salt. And then the other type of salt that I read about that could come out of there is comparable to road salt.
Okay.
Now the Pueblo people had utilized this one type of that salt in meat preservation for centuries. So there's multiple different types of salt that you could get, and it still produces and still has salt to this day. Now that is on private land today, so I'm not sure about the actual if people actually still harvest salt out of there. But you could see them from an airplane. So if you keep your eyes peeled and you're leaving from the Albuquerque Sunport and you're heading back east, that's one of the main flight paths that they'll fly. I've seen it a few times after visiting folks back home on the eastern side of the United States. I said, "Oh yeah, there's Mountain Air, there's the Salt Lakes."
Huh.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just kind of intrigued me, the whole salt thing. But salt is such a vital mineral to life. I mean, and the uses of it are so diverse, especially back in the day when preserving meat, preserving hides, and all of that stuff was life. I mean, it was survival. It was what you had to do, and I would imagine that salt would be a major trade item.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I mentioned, it's not only what attracted people here, but it's what brought others here to trade. This was an area of immense cultural mixation that I was mentioning before. So you're seeing plains groups moving through here quite often, from the likes of the Umano people that usually range in the panhandle of West Texas, but would travel this way, especially if they were on pilgrimage hunts. They've been known to range even out into Arizona from time to time, or at least evidence that they were out there from time to time. And this is a thoroughfare. Abo Pass, like I mentioned before, Abo, people have been through there for centuries. There's even evidence that Ice Age hunters used Abo Pass to get through, and it's naturally a thoroughfare for people. Today, US 60 runs on there, and also the BNSF Railroad runs through there, the Belen Cutoff. But you got the natural pass between the Pino Mountains and the Manzano Mountains, and then when you get past the Pinos, you run right into the Chupadera Mesa, which is looming in the background. So, which is also the same mesa that Gran Quivira sits up the southeastern side of. So, it's just a natural pass for people, and we've seen that for centuries.
Okay. Another question, or something I would like for you to explain, is you've got a really wide time period here. You stated 800 year 800, and then on up through 1680 was the main focus of this. And I'm assuming that people lived in each one of these areas, traded and all that from that whole time period. But the Spanish conquistadors or whoever, Coronado and that group, they didn't come into this area until when? The 1500s?
Yeah, and here we're a bit south of the initial explorations in the 1580s and 90s.
Okay.
The first group of Spanish explorers that really spent time in this area was around 1600, and they spent time more so around Abo and Quarai than they did Gran Quivira, so they wouldn't have made it down quite that far. The Pueblo people, so year 800, we're talking more ancestral Pueblo people.
Okay. And when you talk about Pueblo people, you're talking about people that build permanent structures. I'm assuming that they were agrarian in society. They built multi-family structures that were kind of like a big mall, I guess is the way to describe them. There were lots of little rooms. There were lots of storage areas for their corn and for their agricultural products that kept them through the year. They had kivas, which are round or square holes in the ground that were covered for meeting houses and some of that type of stuff. But the Puebloan people, they lived as a mass group, from what I've been able to determine from other ruins and what I've seen here. But when the missionaries or the Jesuits or whoever came in, they set up large churches with walled facilities. Now, were the Pueblos walled also, like to protect from other warring tribes, or
no? And there's been research that's been done on the different eras of buildings. So, in the 800s, the evidence on is not masonry style Pueblos. It's still that Here, it's a little bit later than some of the other areas in the Four Corners. Here in 800, we still see pit house structures that would have been built.
Now you're saying like dig a hole and then cover it with a thatched roof or something?
Yeah. Basically an earthen roof, and then juniper that's used as supports. And they were subterranean, basically underground a bit.
Okay.
Not more than about 6 feet or so. But
they were only 5'4" tall.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it depends. Yeah. That's what you're really seeing around here at that time.
Okay.
And then as you move on, getting around 1,000, 900 to 1,000, you'll see Jacal style structures that are popping up in the Pueblos, which are, if you're familiar with Eastern longhouses of the woodland people, back in the East Coast, they're basically rectangular style single block structures that are made of tied together juniper and basically a packed earth style plaster for heat retention. You see evidences of those foundations in the area. And then you really see the first style of the masonry pueblos pop up at Abo, roughly around the late 1100s, early 1200s. And that's your locally quarried red sandstone with an adobe style plastering. And then there's some studies that say that there could have been a gypsum style plaster in the Pueblos, which is interesting. There were gypsum deposits left behind from when the Estancia Basin used to be Lake Estancia. So there was gypsum available in the era. The churches actually, Abo and Quarai, most likely had a white gypsum plaster as the exterior plastering.
Really?
Yeah, so you're seeing that base layer of stone. Traditionally, the Spanish churches, they had a layer of an adobe plaster and then a thin layer of a finishing white plaster. Now at Quarai and Abo, it most likely was gypsum. That's what mostly was found during the archaeological studies, was gypsum flakes at the bases of the walls. Gran Quivira most likely was lime. A lot of lime plaster was found there, which is your normal style white plaster. But the gypsum is unique. And I was talking to one of the archaeologists that did studies through Abo Pass in the 1980s. They did larger scale studies back in the 1980s on different smaller Pueblo sites. And I asked him about plastering, and he said they believe that a lot of the plaster was white gypsum, which is super unique. And if you've ever been to White Sands National Park, that's white gypsum sand. And there's that distinguishing sparkle to it when it's in the sun.
Right.
If you could just imagine those churches on a bright and sunny day, the sparkle and gleam that had to give off.
That would have been amazing.
It had to be amazing.
It's blinding when you go to White Sands.
It is, yes, it is. And imagine that on a landscape that doesn't have that, and just this white gleaming structure in the distance that you'd be able to see for miles is what that's what people would see.
Now, when we talk about the inner structures on these churches that were constructed in the 1600s, you have walls that are 2.5, 3 foot thick almost. Now, of course, they go up 3 stories. I'm assuming that the reason that they're so wide is just for support, because if they were little narrow walls like what we see in our houses and stuff now, there would be no structural strength against wind or anything else. But I can't even imagine what it looked like when you had people having to chip rocks at the quarry, other people possibly hauling them. It had to have looked like an ant mound if you were looking at it from up above, with hundreds of people or even thousands of people quarrying, carrying, and stacking all these rocks, because I'm going to just throw a wild guess out there. There's 10 million rocks in each one of these facilities. Easily 10 million.
Yeah, and the Pueblo people, and that's one thing as you travel around New Mexico and see the different Pueblos, they were immensely skilled builders.
Right.
And they still are. The Pueblo societies are amazing builders. They're amazing masons, and they did things that people that were living in other areas of this territory in this country had no idea how to do. And that's the important factor here of how would you be able to build large structures out of an area that, Franciscans and Spanish folks, that are coming from Spain or from New Spain and in Mexico, have no idea how to do.
Right.
I always explain these pueblos as they were city centers, and you really get that feeling when you're at Gran Quivira. Gran Quivira is the only one of our sites that has excavated pueblo mounds there.
Right.
And when you're standing in there and you see these pueblo foundations that are all around you, and you kind of get taken back. There's a strong silence at Gran Quivira, and it's hard to explain, but sometimes in that silence you could just hear the voices and the bustling and the people that they're creating, they're weaving, they're trading, they're going on hunts, they're farming. You just get taken back to the societies of yesterday, and it gives you an appreciation for the site that much more.
Definitely. And that is intriguing, because you do have some of it dug out. And the thing that's cool, really, really cool, and the thing I've always liked about Aztec that I find so much more interesting here is it's more of an open site. You go to a place like Mesa Verde and you walk your half mile down and you get to see the cliff dwellings that everybody sees the pictures of, and it's absolutely phenomenal. And then they say, well, now we've given our speech about how these people lived and stuff. You're standing in this one little area, and they say, now you can look around. And as soon as you take 3 steps off of the beaten path, it's, oh, no, don't go there. Oh, no, don't go there. And so you get the feeling that you just are supposed to stand and turn around in a circle to look around. Whereas these places, and that's what I like so much about Aztec, and even Hovenweep is somewhat like that. But this place, you can get in, you can walk through the facilities, and it's a maze. I don't know how these Franciscans found their way around, because it's nothing but a maze as you're walking through here, and all the walls are 4 foot to 60 foot tall, and you're walking through this maze, and it's just amazing because of the ability to hands-on actually feel, look, touch, and experience some of what was going on there. And like you said, it takes your mind back to where you can almost hear what was happening, and your imagination just goes wild. It's awesome.
It does. And there's a sound of silence. It could be a way to describe it at each one of the sites. That now weekends will get a little less quiet, but if you're there during a weekday, and sometimes you may be the only people at the site, it's amazing. We don't have many planes that fly above, especially at Gran Quivira. In fact, in one of our resource studies, it mentions that Gran Quivira almost has an exact soundscape of the quietness that it would have during the 1600s and prior to, minus the bustling of a city that was there. So you can really just take time to reflect on what's there and focus your mind on the story. So talk about, not only is it an incredible story at each site, but you have a good medium or a good way to experience that. You have some quiet, some solitude, you have wayside exhibits, and then if you're in the summertime, you might stumble upon one of our guided programs, and then you get an even more in-depth look.
I thought you were going to say rattlesnakes.
And you could. Guided rattlesnake.
There are signs everywhere that say, please respect our rattlesnakes.
Yes.
We were talking just before we started the podcast that you guys have all been trained how to go out and get the rattlesnakes off of the path.
Yes, just in case, because our main goal, and I always describe it this way because it's the same deal. If you're in Yellowstone and a bison's on the road, you don't move the bison if you stop traffic, let the bison move on. So that's
you go up and pet it.
Yes,
we
yes.
we have a
Yeah.
bison versus
Yeah.
tourist
Yes,
count
yes.
every year
Yeah.
and the bison always win. It
Oh,
seems
yeah.
like the numbers are always like 30-1.
They always get their way.
But no, you get out and you chase that bison off the road. That's the appropriate thing to do.
Yes. Oh, that's funny. But rattlesnakes are much easier to move than a bison. So that's what, we usually, the first thing you do is, you try to go out there and let it move on itself, because we try to, the least amount possible to move or disturb the wildlife, because the National Park Service, we have a unique mission. We have a dual mandate. We're a preservation agency that has to, we must preserve all of our natural and cultural resources unimpaired for future generations. But dually, we have to provide access to those resources to the public as much as possible. That's a tough mission.
Yes.
Because you're balancing visitor use with protecting the resources. So like in that scenario, you got a rattlesnake, which is a part of a natural resource, and then you have public use. If they're in a high public use area, your first instinct shouldn't be to go out and move the rattlesnake and put it somewhere else. It's to be there to warn folks, hey, there's a rattlesnake here, I'm giving it some time to move on. And then, if for some reason it doesn't want to move on, then we'll grab one of the snake hooks and move it off the side of the trail. So it's like, that's the same thing with the bison, is you serve as a safety officer, go out and keep people safe, but let the wildlife and, let them do their thing too. We're a team in that scenario.
And how many rattlesnakes a year do you move off the path?
It just depends, Quarai doesn't see that many. It saw a few last year, which some of the longtime staff here said that they've went like over 10 years without seeing a rattlesnake at Quarai. So that's pretty interesting. But Grand Quivira and Abo, you'll see them, Abo especially, pretty often. But they usually they won't mess with you, especially if they're not if they're off the trail. In fact, you probably walk right past one without rattling, because they don't want to make themselves known if they don't have to.
They're not an aggressive snake.
No, they are not. They are if they do anything, it's a defensive action. You could walk right past them and they won't rattle or make any noise. But, of course, if you're walking towards them with a stick or something, that you're not supposed to be doing, then they will defend themselves if they have to. So usually they're pretty, there's a lot more aggressive snake breeds across the nation than rattlesnakes. They kind of get a bad reputation.
Now, do you find, just as another curiosity point, that the rattlesnakes are going along their happy way and they hit that nice warm pavement because you've got really nice trails that are wheelchair accessible and stuff? Do they have a tendency to go, oh, hey, I kind of like this warm spot and want to stay there?
They do sometimes, but I tell you, with having like red sandstone ruins and that, they have a lot of places that they feel that.
Okay.
So sometimes, I see them a lot at Abo in the resettlement structures, which are the smaller structures you see on the way into the site.
Okay.
I've seen snakes in there quite a bit. So they have a lot of places to do that. And then, of course, once you get into the heat of summer, they won't be out there because that's way too hot for them, because they can't, regulate their body temperature.
Right.
So if they're on a hot path that's, a dark, deep red, and it's 80 degrees, their blood is feeling, well over 100 degrees, and it'll start to literally boil. So, you'll see them in shaded areas a lot in the summertime too. So this time of year, you do need to be cognizant, because if it's above ground temperature, you could see them out, and, you could see them sunning themselves on a, 50, 60 degree day and getting some sun. That's plausible.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
I
don't want anybody to not come see this stuff because there's a possibility of snakes.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. It's just you keep your eyes peeled and be cognizant of the environment, and everything's fine. And usually the thing to do is if you do see a snake out that's close to the path or on the path, is just go back and tell whoever's working in the visitor center, the ranger, that there's one and location, and then we'll be out to assess, what we need to do. Just be there as a safety officer. If it doesn't move on, just move it off the trail. So that's the best word of advice if you do come across one at the park.
Okay. And now let's get back to the ruins themselves, because we've now gone down one of our rabbit holes that I have a tendency to do. But what is the state of these ruins? Are they in a state of arrested decay? Are they in a state of preservation? Are they what exactly is your purpose with having these on display, letting people see them, and your preservation status with it?
Yeah, we do stabilization. They're in a stable state where we're trying to preserve them the way that they are now for the future. So we do rotations. There's stabilization that happens at the park itself every year. However, it's each site gets it every 3 years. It's once every 3 years.
What do you mean stabilization?
So basically, they'll repair the mortars where the stone is. If they see part of the convento wall, let's say, is sometimes they'll either buckle in an area or they'll bulge. They'll take the stone down, fix the mortar, and then put the stone back. So they'll do small stabilization efforts like that. Sometimes they'll just shore up the mortaring and put another layer on, or bear it down and put another layer. And it's a cool that we utilize this labor sources. We hire pathways positions for these. And the pathways positions, one of the criteria, actually the main criteria, is that you are currently enrolled in a college or university, or in high school even. And so we'll hire a lot of folks that are either wanting preservation as a career choice when they're in college, or some local folks in the community that have a strong connection to the site that would like to apply. We've had a lot of that. And then we even have people that are on staff today that have gotten their start in facilities, that have gotten their start at stabilization through that program. So it's a great program that we utilize. And then, of course, the ruins get stabilized, once every 3 years and one every year. So it's kind of a win-win.
Okay. And now what we see when we come to these ruins, as far as the tall walls and everything, that is the way that this was found, let's say in the 1800s, when it was rediscovered?
For the most part. So each site's a little bit different when it comes to that. Quarai, for example, it's very complete. There was a little bit heavier stabilization done there. So stabilization will include could include minor reconstruction. So at Quarai, they basically had to reconnect the front facade where the choir loft entrance is to where the old choir loft was, because that's crucial. That was a crucial stabilizing to keep the walls kind of in the current position. At a bow, for example, early stabilization that was done not correctly almost buckled the bottom sections of the walls. This was prior to the MPS. This was when it was managed by the state and UNM. They did earlier reconstruction or stabilization work and built, kind of finished off the top of the bell tower.
Okay.
And only supported it with 2 lintels, and it found that wasn't enough to hold the weight of the height of the tower, and it started to buckle the bottom walls. So that was one thing. One of the early stabilization efforts when the MPS took over was by shoring up the bell tower, adding 2 more lintels. So now today you'll see there's 4 lintels there.
Okay.
And then of course that's enough to stabilize. And so there's a lot, and that is not my background, but it's very fascinating to read about that. Because there's some intricacies to it. Not only were those intricate for people to build during that time and to design, but it's hard for us today, even to fathom, especially not having that background, to fathom how they built it and how to keep it in its current state without detracting from the authenticity of it, because that's ultimately that's why we're here, and that's why it's a unit of the Park Service, because of its national significance, and what's left is so significant.
Right. Okay, but now a lot of the Pueblo buildings and that kind of stuff are still underground at these
Yes.
sites.
Yes, and those thing to remember, most of those sites too are much older. So the way the mission system was set up is that they were centered around population centers. Pecos, they were there at a pueblo. So all of ours there was a pueblo first, and then there was a mission that came after.
Right.
So a lot of the pueblo structures are much older than the Spanish structures.
Okay, and in the beginning of our discussion, you said that this is kind of, I'm going to use the word a melting pot or a tradition conglomeration. So you had your pueblos from 800 to 1600 or so that were just operating with Pueblo rule, Pueblo religion, native religion, whatever. And then you had your Franciscans came in. They explained the process of how they got the people to cooperate, to work with them, and how they maybe operated and converted, because it seems like there's a situation where they have blended Catholicism and native cultures into a religion that maybe worked to where they were able to. I don't know if I want to use the word control or not, because maybe the people weren't controlled. Maybe they voluntarily acquiesced and decided to help build these because they love the structures or love the priests or whatever the case is. Explain some of that tradition blending aspect.
And people, the big thing to remember here is that the off the start is that people are very complex. So this story is very complex. Early on, I always explain it that you have two cultures with two different mind frames, two different world experiences, two different, multiple different languages between the two of them that are coming together for the first time in history. And that right off the bat creates many cultural misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. It could lead to good things, but oftentimes led to conflict. Initially, what's going on is, we're here a little bit south of what's going on in, northern New Mexico and the mission system there, like Acoma and Pecos. So they're a bit a ways away from those folks. They have trade items from them, but as far as interaction with them, different language groups and different subsets of culture in the Pueblo world. So when the Spanish first arrive here, they're bringing certain things like, they're bringing different crops that have not been cultivated here before, like wheat. They're bringing apple trees and cantaloupes and watermelon. They're bringing all different types of crops. They're bringing livestock here. They're bringing, guns. And one of the things they're bringing too is military around in the area, military protection. So this area of New Mexico is enwrapped in cultural, like I said, cultural mixing. So you have some groups of people, Plains people, that were they had very good relationships with the Pueblo people and traded very well with the Pueblo people. Then you have some groups that were not. The evidence shows that the Pueblo people did not have that much of a military infrastructure at these sites. So one of the enticing things could have been military protection for the Pueblo people if they needed it. So early on, with early interaction before this system was in full swing, there was a potential for both sides as seeing it as a chance of collaboration, especially from the Pueblo eyes. They may see it as an opportunity to trade and to learn and to gain some protection. And remembering that the Pueblo society is a communal type society for the most part, and supporting each other and living together. So there's many different factors of how the Spanish may have originally been welcomed into some of these areas. And then once they were welcomed, it's you see the relationship kind of teeter and totter back and forth. But it's interesting because you'll read some of the primary sources from this era, and of course the Spanish are writing about the baptisms and things that were happening within these pueblos. But this is the best example I like to use about how cultures that have different world beliefs and misunderstandings, how they happen, is that the Franciscans see this as the Pueblo people are being baptized, and now they are members of the Catholic Church, whereas the Pueblo people may be seeing it as just a ceremony or a communal gathering or a communal ceremony, spiritual ceremony. They may not understand what they're doing.
Right.
So you may have had everybody that was baptized, but another culture that is not familiar with that type of religion may not understand what that means. So now you have one side that thinks, oh yeah, they are with us and this is what they're doing, and they see them as doing anything different as acts of defiance, to another side of just preserving their way of life and trying to be communal livers with people that are moving to the area that are trading. So you have two different mind frames. And then, of course, in Spain's eyes, this territory belongs to the Spanish crown.
Right.
In the European style of government, they have land rights. In the Pueblo mind, they've lived here for centuries, way longer than the Spanish have been in this region. Their ancestors have migrated to the area and have been transient through the area for generations. So in their minds, they're very connected to the land. They live with the land and utilize the land, and it's their home. So you have two way different ideas, and that varies in the Pueblo world too. The Pueblo people are incredibly diverse, to where you have multiple different language groups. Right here you have Tompiro and Tiwa, that are two different language groups within 15 miles of each other here.
Wow.
But you also have people that speak Tiwa at Coronado, where you were at.
Right.
That was a Tiwa Pueblo. And you also have Tiwa way up in Taos. And today you have Tiwa in Isleta, in El Paso. So you have language groups that travel everywhere. And then here was mainly Tompiro. And then they were considered Eastern Tompiro at Gran Quivira. And then there was Piro and Socorro that might have been an accent. So you have all these diverse Pueblo peoples that have different spiritual ceremonies and different worldviews and ideas, but we for time's sake we just mention them all as Pueblo people because they share similar building style, similar ways of life to each other. But that just adds to the complexity of the story, So, really, it's not so cut and dry of, what was the story? Was it a positive connotation? Was it a negative connotation? Was it neutral? It varied. When times were lean, this whole area was struggling to survive. From 1667 to 1668, or from 1667 to 1672, there was a sustained drought period to where you saw in 1668 450 people die at Gran Quivira of starvation because there wasn't enough water to cultivate crops in the local area. So when times are tough like that, you do what you have to do to survive. So that's also when you see a big breakdown in the mission system. You see the fall of some of the missions. You see the Abo. You see the Franciscans being forced out by the Tompiro by the burning of the convento. in 1672, which, remember, is 8 years prior to the outbreak of the Pueblo Revolt. You also see, on the other side of the spectrum, Quarai. When Quarai was abandoned, you see a migration of the Tiwa people and the Franciscans together to another mission in Tehique. And at Gran Quivira, you see a little bit of a mystery. You see some upticks and some attacks that happened, mainly resource-based attacks, trying to survive from Plains groups that were primarily trading with the Pueblo people prior to this. But like I said, when times are tough, you need to do what you have to do to survive. So you see sort of a scattering of people after some hostility in the area, and a little bit less is known about Gran Quivira's fall. So it's a very complex story that is very based on circumstance. It's based on relationships of individuals with other individuals, and you see highs and lows in the different periods of the site here. But I think it just adds to the complexity and interesting story
and the mystery.
Yeah, and that's a big thing too in the history. There's a lot of mystery engulfed in it because a lot of it happened a long time ago. There's other sites. My background is in actually political history, mainly prior to the Civil War. So there's a lot of source material on that. There's a lot less source material on this. And we basically go a lot by archaeology. Archaeology is really king out here in the Southwest, and also by listening to the Pueblo people that remain here today and the tribal groups that are here today, and hearing their perspectives on the story, which is always my favorite thing to do, because it always factors into the way I interpret the resource, because they have their stories, and they are still today, practicing some of the same things they did historically, and some of the same traditions that they had, and they're still moving forward today and wanting to, they're still around, and they're still doing amazing things within their communities. So they're great to hear about and to work with.
Now, did the Franciscans keep really good records? I know that for the most part, the Catholic Church kept good records of everything that they did in the places that they were. When they left these missions, did those records go to a central clearinghouse, so to speak?
They really did. Yeah, we have source material on really niche things, specific things, like amounts of supplies they got when they started missions, like how many nails they got, how many chickens they got. We have that. And we have, certain stories that were written by journals of settlers that were in the area too.
Okay.
Because, you start to see estancia farms pop up around the area. And they write stories about what's happening in the area. So we do have some records about storage of some of the excess and surplus crops.
What about like everyday life? Just everyday
daily life's a little bit fewer and far between. We do know like some of the courses. So one of the functions in the convento was to serve as an education space for Pueblo children, and we do know some of the courses that were taught in there. Like we know there was a choir class, there was a Spanish and Latin class. There was probably a spiritual class. So we do know some of that. We know what the individual rooms in the convento were used for. We know roughly the sizes they were building. So we do have some records. Most of those, I believe, are actually housed in either Spain or Mexico. They're not. Okay. They don't belong to like the U.S. government.
So do you have access to them to where you can read them, or are they pretty much locked up in a...
A lot of the primary source things I don't think we do, but luckily we've had multiple resource studies that were written on the site. So one of the first things that happens when basically any park is entered into the National Park Service is that there's a series of studies that are done on the site, and a lot of them you'll see historic, especially if it's like a historic home or something, you'll see a historic structures report, a cultural resource study, you'll see cultural landscape reports and inventories done. So our biggest one here, we have a historic resource study, and that referenced quite a bit of primary source documentation that you just can't find, that had to actually take special visits. And most of those actually are done out of a higher office. They're done out of either a regional or a Washington office. They'll send the Park Service. We have historians that's their function.
Okay.
And we have like main archaeology offices that's their function. So that's how we get most of our that's where we get most of our information, and that's where we get most of our interpretation. Between that and the voices of the people that are here, is how we craft most of our interpretation.
The one thing that really kind of struck me as interesting is kind of going back to the blending of traditions. Is at these sites, at least two of them. GQ, I'm not so sure about because it didn't strike me there, but the other two sites, you have the mission building, and inside of the mission building, they have what appear to be kivas, which are religious centers for the Puebloan people. And they were right inside of the church, to where they almost had to have been blending their religion somehow or another. And then the other thing that I noticed that was interesting was you had one placard that talked about in the 1600s, they had organs and other musical type instruments inside of the missions, which is just mind-boggling to me. Where in the world did the organ come from?
Yeah, they a lot of that stuff traveled. So that's another thing that kind of makes Abo an important area, is that they would use basically the route of US 60 as a path back to the Camino Real, which basically runs where Route 25 is today along the Rio Grande River.
And that was a major trail, trading trail.
And that was so there was a 3-year supply train of wagons that came up from Mexico City to supply the missions.
And it came up through Las Cruces.
Yeah.
We went to a couple of other military sites that were along the Camino Real. And they come all the way on up from Mexico, Mexico City, through Las Cruces and on up into Albuquerque.
Yeah, that's basically the route of the Camino Real. And they actually, so the mission system was based out of Santo Domingo, and they would take the supply trains up to Santo Domingo, and they would split. They would send a group of them out west to supply the pueblos and missions out, towards Acoma and out west towards Grants today. And then they would send one that would continue north to supply northern pueblos and missions. And then they would send one to the east towards Galisteo. And then we believe that was the one that came down south to supply this mission here. And then it basically would run today along the Salt Missions Trail, which is roughly where 337 runs, and down through Tijeras Canyon, because you had a series of pueblos there. You had, Tejique, you had Chiloli, and towns that are still there today. And you also had missions there that they supplied. And then, of course, Coray, which is along that route. And then it's believed to be that they made sort of a loop and went to Abo, and then dropped a bunch of supplies off at Abo, especially because the archaeology shows there were larger storage spaces at Abo than some of the other places, and then dump supplies off there that would then be distributed amongst the missions to the south. So Gran Quivira and there was a large pueblo at Tabira and Tenebo, and then they would continue basically through Abo Pass, where Route 60 is, back to the Camino Real. But the kicker is they had to go back to Santo Domingo prior to going back to Mexico City. If I was them, I would have said, you guys can pick me up in Bernardo, which is the town present day there, and then pick us up on the way there. But the Route 60, where it is today through Abo Pass, that the road that was through there, many people commented on how nice of a road it was. Lieutenant Abert of the Topographical Engineers of the United States, who was through here in 1846, mentioned what a fine road it was. And Carleton of the U.S. Cavalry in 1853, when he's coming through the area, actually said it was something along the lines of the finest road in the territory that he's seen. Was the road that is running through Abo Pass. So it shows that it was a well manicured road, even prior to its paved state now. So it was an established road.
Now Carleton is the one that rediscovered these in the 1800s. Is that right?
No.
Okay, I thought I read that on one of the placards.
No, that's not. No. There were resettlers here way before that. So actually, the first major resettlement era in the park was 1800 at Quarai, and a little bit later at Abo in 1815. Those two lasted till about 1830. And then you see another brief period at Quarai. People were back at Quarai in the late 1830s, early 1840s. And then Abo, you don't see people return permanently again until the late 1860s. And it was actually a group of hunters that came through the area. They were bison hunting.
Okay.
And they actually came by Abo, and they had family that lived there in the early resettlement period. And so they decided to give it another go. They came back another couple years later, and that same family is still living in that area. And
really?
Still own all around the park.
Wow.
Yep. And they actually it would have been their family member, whether it was grandpap, dad. Frederico was actually the first park ranger when it became a national
and
park.
He's buried on site.
Yes, he is the grave you will see on site today. And actually, all that was his property. He sold most of it to the state, and then actually donated a little stretch of it when they were doing archaeology, and found that lots of the church was still on his land. It was much larger than they thought at first. And he donated the rest of it. And he was a very passionate man that cared very deeply and had such a strong connection, as did many people to Abo and to the area. So yeah, that's what Abo is super significant in that regard too, that it was a major drop-off point for these supplies, and it was an easy way back to the Camino Real coming from the east and from the south.
Can you imagine being back in the early 1800s, 1700s, riding your horse out looking for maybe a vein of gold, or running away from some hostile natives when you're doing your fur trapping, and all of a sudden coming upon one of these structures just as you top a hill? And it'd have to be just absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, the whole concept of what the hell is this? And then walking around through the mazes trying to, the whole idea just has my mind spinning.
You think of it, it's funny too, because it's funny because like you not necessarily rediscover, but you come across these structures, from time to time when you're in a new area for the first time. And today you kind of have that same feeling of rediscovery of
you do
things. Especially moving here from another area everything's a new discovery. To you, it's just amazing. But then you start thinking back to the people that created this, and the people that first came here, and the people that knew the land like the back of their hand, and you get a whole nother appreciation for the site. And that's even you're going back to the Pueblo people that amazingly survived in an area that almost seems unsurvivable. They thrived in this area and still thrive today. It's incredible.
makes you wonder if there's been a climate change in the last 600 years.
Yes.
I didn't just say that. You know, and back to the discovery thing. We were pulling into Guevara, and did I say that right?
Talking about Gran Quivira
No,
or Querai?
Querai.
Querai.
Okay. Yep. See, there we go.
And it could be any of them. Yeah.
But as we're pulling into there, we're driving in around the way the road comes in, and Linda says, "I don't even see it. This here must not really be one." And you had this little tiny window and I says, "No, it's there.
Yeah.
It's amazingly
there.
there."
Yeah.
And she's going, "Where? I don't see it." I says, "You'll see it soon enough." We get out of the truck and I walk her back, and it's there. It's almost like you just rediscovered, because there's nothing. You see nothing until you get into that parking lot, and you have just that one little window where you see the mission, and it's like an elephant in the room.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's in Querai especially because it's a massive structure. That's
Oh, it
left.
is. They're all massive.
And the sun hits Querai depending on what time of day you're there, in just amazing angles, and it just glows.
And the colors are wonderful. I mean, I can't even imagine it with the white wash on the outside.
Yeah.
That had to have been just like see it for miles, and just majestic.
Yeah.
Just So, how long have you been working here at this particular site?
Here, not entirely long. About a year and a half or so.
You've really got a lot of knowledge about what's going on. I'm impressed. I'm impressed with your recall and your research.
Well, it's we all do, but I personally find it as to do justice to people that were here, and to tell the story in not only the most accurate way, but to convey all the specialties and the triumphs and the ups and the downs and the sadness and the happiness. And there's so much behind the story, but to tell that in an accurate way, you have to do due diligence and research and talk to people, just basically that's what we are as interpreters, right? As interpretive rangers, we're here to tell the story and bring the story alive of the people that are responsible for those cultural resources. And to be able to do that, it takes a lot of effort and research and consideration of sources, and sometimes reading things that are hard to read, and you wonder how people could sometimes do the things that they do, and then you start thinking of perspectives and time periods and motives and misguided views, and it's a rabbit hole sometimes.
Oh, I'm sure.
But it's amazingly fascinating to study.
And you said you had one of these in particular that was your favorite when we were talking on the phone.
Yeah, I love them all, but a bow has a special place in my heart. It was one of the first sites that I worked at when I came here, and the mountains in the background just struck me. And then once I started reading about the story, and the Tampiro people are fascinating people, a language group that very few words are known still of the Tampiro people, still I've had the opportunity to talk to people that have descended from the Tampiro people that ranged in the area, a very special group of people, and to learn about the culture, and to see the pottery left behind that they've produced, and just the sheer amount of people that belong to that language group. They were known here, that's for sure. And today they're left behind, not only with their ancestors, but or with their descendants, but the ancestors their voices are still here. They're here in the wind. They're here in the rain. They're still here.
That is awesome. Okay, one more question,
Yeah.
and we'll close this thing out. When we were walking through, I think, Abo, you had placard that talked about a turret that was built. Is that at Abo?
Yeah, that was at Quarai.
That was at Quarai.
Yeah,
Okay. And the turret, it says, was built in the 1800s.
Yes.
And so that was built on that site well after everything else had been deteriorated and everything else. So was there a group of people that were living there at the time?
So Quarai had...
And let's explain a turn real quick.
Yeah, so we pronounce it Torreon.
Okay, Torreon.
That's like the Spanish pronunciation. There's actually a town of Torreon too.
Okay.
Which oddly enough, I don't think there's a Torreon there still. But anyway,
there is one in Lincoln as you drive.
There is. Lincoln. Yeah, there is, right in the middle of town.
We talked about that one when we had our podcast there, which I had never heard of before.
Yeah, it's right.
And it's cool, but
yeah, Torreon. It's basically a defensive watchtower. So one of the advantages of here is that you have the mountains and then kind of foothills below the mountains and then flat land. So if you're on the foothills, situated in the foothills like Quarai is, if you build tall, any length, maybe 15, 20 feet up in the air, you're going to be able to see for miles. So that was the main primary purpose of the Torreon, was as a defensive central hub, because you'll see there's some foundations that are sort of, if you're walking down the path, it's kind of to the right of the church and to the right of the convento. That was a separate wing of the convento that was built as the kind of city center of the resettlement era, and the Torreon was the heart of that.
So that whole area had been built in the 1800s.
Yeah, that bottom part. Yes.
Okay.
And actually,
because it still looks like it's part of the
and that's by design, because actually some of the convento had been modified for resettlement. So that's the one factor at Quarai, is that there was heavier resettlement there.
Okay.
And there was also modifications done by resettlers to the convento, i.e. widening walls and doorways, and making some of the convento areas as an actual living space. So we did see more modification in that time, because a lot was left of Quarai for a long period of time. Quarai was very well preserved for about a couple hundred years, time after that had not been too kind to Quarai, but the convento was largely intact for quite a while. So it was able to be salvaged for resettlers. At Abo is a different story. They built separate structures, as you can still see today. And Grand Quivira the same. There was resettlement there. You can't see any of those structures left. They're not there, but they built largely separate. So Quarai, they kind of just added on, is an easy way to describe that. And that was, like I mentioned, there were only brief periods of inhabitation at Quarai once you hit the 1800s. From 1677 until, roughly 1800, you don't see permanent residency there. Most groups had migrated on. But once you hit 1800, it's inhabited pretty frequently.
Okay.
And that's so when the topographical engineers came in the area, which a lot of folks don't know about them, they actually came in 1846, just prior to the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. So technically they were probably trespassing on Mexican territory but their purpose was to basically map out this area of New Mexico in preparation for the war. But they were also taking an account of what they saw. So they visited these sites because they heard about them, and they visited Quarai, and Lieutenant Abert, second lieutenant, he painted a watercolor of Quarai, painted a watercolor of Abo, and actually did a sketch of Quarai as well.
Really?
And those are the first artist renditions that we have of the sites. That was done by Lieutenant Abert.
Are those the ones that are on the placards?
I believe we do have them on there. Yeah, and we have them hanging in the visitor centers. The first artist renditions of the park were done by a second lieutenant.
Cool.
He wrote a journal, and in his journal he mentioned about the resettlers at Quarai were the ones that took him to Abo. because there was nobody currently residing at Abo.
Okay.
Which we knew that, but that just kind of confirms that. And then when Carlton comes back, most of our waysides are centered around Carlton for military wise that are coming in the area, which that's one thing I would like to change. I'd love a wayside about Lieutenant Abaird, because he was mainly an exploratory mission that came through here he was like that first one that took measurements of the sites to see what was left. So he did some important work preservation wise that we can use even today in the resource study. It mentions what his measurements were, what Carlton's measurements were, and then what Bandelier's measurements were, and then everybody that came through and took measurements. So then you can kind of track the degradation from that time year to year, like, a lot of Quarai is missing, or the wall is a lot shorter this year than it was that year. So they didn't know it, but they did some important work for preservation, which could be a positive that comes from the exploratory missions out here, one of the few that you might pull. But yeah. So
cool.
Yeah, so I love Abaird's watercolors. They are, the topographical engineers were all officers. They were a branch of the Army engineers. They were responsible for doing things like surveying for lighthouses and for bridges and canals, and basically did the highly technical work that the Army engineers needed highly trained officers for. They usually did that type of work. And that's the same thing out here. They sent them because they wanted a detailed account of missions and ruins and structures and topography and water, and they needed to send highly trained troops. So they were basically all West Pointers that came out here. And actually, funny, Lieutenant Abaird, his dad was in charge. Colonel William Abaird, which you may have heard of, the Abaird squirrel or the tassel-eared squirrel. It's named after Colonel Abaird, and the Abaird's Towhee is named after Lieutenant Abaird. So,
how would you like to be known as a squirrel?
Yes. What a legacy!
What a legacy! That squirrel's named after me. I wonder what they were thinking.
Yeah. See there? That's big.
Right. Okay. Well, you guys have a website particular to this site. Yeah.
We so our website, it's NPS as in National Park Service.gov/SAPU, and that's going to be your central hub to find park information, our hours. Right now we're still on winter hours.
Okay.
So like all the sites, the trails and the restrooms are open from 9 a.m. through 4 p.m. and the gates close at 4 as well. And then the visitor centers are open Thursday through Monday, 9 a.m. through 4 p.m. and of course the rest of the site. But we'll be switching to summer hours here starting in May. And then we'll switch 9 to 5 daily, both the trails, restrooms, and then also the visitor center. So we'll be switching to that in May. And we also, this is about our busy season we'll be getting into here pretty soon. School group season, which we encourage, especially fourth grade groups, to come out because we do offer the Every Kid Outdoors free pass for fourth graders. And then, of course, we do offer the free both the annual and the military passes to the annual military passes and then the lifetime military passes free of charge to veterans and active duty military. And then, of course, we're fee free. So, we don't charge an entrance fee to the site. So you're welcome to come and visit.
Isn't that amazing? You can come here, spend the day. If you're in New Mexico, if you're not in New Mexico, make it a point to come here and spend the day, and you can do it for free.
Yeah.
What a deal.
Yeah, that's the word I use to describe New Mexico is diverse. So you can come to New Mexico, and whether you want mountains, you want desert, you want Pueblo culture, you want Hispanic and Latino culture. Whatever type of culture you want is here. Whatever landscape you want is here, and really whatever weather you want is going to be here too. So,
New Mexico is awesome. We love New Mexico. In fact, I think right now we have more podcasts in New Mexico than any other state. But we've been here for over a month in New Mexico. We're on our way home, kind of somehow or another. But we've spent a lot of time here. We've really, really enjoyed it. But I always finish out my podcasts by saying the world is full of wonder. People need to get out and explore. If you haven't seen some of the ruins in this country, you need to get out and see them. And I would highly encourage, especially these particular ruins. I've been to probably 50, 60 different sites. These are by far and away my favorites, including the big, well-known ones. And everybody have an absolutely wonder-filled day.
Haul the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?